Okie dokie, here we go. So glazes. Glazing is a huge part of ceramics, and it's something that kind of breaks my heart a little bit that we haven't had a chance to really explore yet this year. But I do want to teach you about it. I want you to understand what it is and all the possibilities within glazing. So we're going to be talking about glazing with ceramic glazes and also how to paint your piece with acrylics. This is what we're going to be doing with our final for this class for the semester is going to be an abstract sculpture, and you're going to be painting with acrylic paint. And then we're going to be actually putting it into an AR program so that the viewers can see your piece from all sides. So that's going to be kind of fun, and we're going to jump into that next week. So what are the different types of glazes that you can choose from in this classroom and in general? We have something called underglaze, which comes in those thin bottles, and you put that underneath a clear glaze or clear overglaze, which is in the mint green bottle, or the glaze looks green, but it actually turns out pretty clear. And then the underglaze is basically like a non-shiny coat of color. And typically you need like at least 2 brushes or 2 coats of that to make it kind of an opaque color. So those 2 things go together. If you don't want to do both of those things, you can choose a glaze that has those things combined. So it has the color and then also the type of sheen mixed into it. So glazes can be really a matte kind of finish, or they can have a shiny finish, or they can also have a really crusty finish. And it all depends on what's mixed into the glaze. So you can also mix your own glaze if you were in a ceramic studio space with all the raw materials. You would need to mix a glaze that fit your clay body. So what does that mean? Well, a glaze is basically the same ingredients as your clay body, just in different percentages. So your clay has more clay in it and more sand in it, and a little bit of silica, which is glass, which is what makes it melt and stick together. Now your glaze is the same combination of things, but it has way more silica, way less sand, less clay, but it does need a little bit of clay in there so that that clay helps the glaze stick to or bind itself to your clay body. So your glaze body has to fit your clay body. And when I say body, it basically means the recipe of that clay or glaze. And then you have to match up if it's low fire or medium fire or high fire. And we're dealing with low fire in this class because we have an electric kiln that only does low fire. But when you get off to college and you try to use other studio spaces, you're going to have electric kilns that go up to high fire, which I believe in an electric kiln probably cone 8. Which I can talk about in a minute, what that cone means. And then in a gas kiln, you could go all the way up to cone 12 in a gas kiln, which is super, super high fire, porcelains and high fire stoneware. All right, so glaze basically really has infinite possibilities or variables, just like painting and mixing paint on a palette. So each glaze has a very specific recipe, and if you're mixing it in a glaze studio, you would have the gram scales and you would be measuring out grams of glaze. And if you change even 1 gram of something in that glaze, it will be a completely different glaze. So you could just imagine the infinite possibilities there. You could take the recipe for 1 glaze that has like 10, maybe 10 grams of blue copper or green copper oxide in it. And you could mix the base of that glaze and then mix 10 different versions of it, each one having a different percentage of that green copper oxide. And so what you're going to get is the same like kind of glaze. Like if it's a shiny glaze, it'll still be shiny, but that copper oxide will change the color in your glaze. And probably also when you get into higher numbers of that copper oxide, will change the look of your glaze too, because the oxide eventually will affect the surface quality of that glaze. So how do I apply these glazes? Well, there's lots of different ways. You could apply the glaze with a sponge technique, which will give it a different texture. You could brush the glaze on. You could dip the glaze in a giant bucket of glaze, or dip your piece in a bucket of glaze. We don't have that option here because we don't mix glaze in giant buckets. But when you get off to college, they're going to have big buckets of like the standard glazes for the class. And you're going to learn how to use tongs to dip your piece into the glaze. And that's really a wonderful way to glaze something because it gives it a really nice thick coat. So you don't have to brush paint something and taking you hours. You just dip it and it's glazed. Staining is when you rub a glaze into the texture of your piece and then you wipe it away with a sponge. A lot of glaze studios have a spray booth. So you spray your glaze onto the piece, which results in very even coating. And also you have to do lots of layers, right? Because it comes out a little thinner. And then layering of your glazing techniques. You know, you could stain it and then sponge on top of it, or stain it and brush it. If you were in the classroom and we were here together, we would be doing this as a test tile assignment where you would be making different test tiles, experimenting with these techniques. So eventually we might do that, but I'm not really sure. So general rules about how you glaze something. You really want 1 to 3 coats of underglaze, 1 to 2 coats of overglaze, and 3 coats of glaze. Because if you put it on really thin, it could turn out not even shiny. So here's some pictures of some different application techniques. Here's the sponging, here's the brushing, and another picture of brushing. Here's the dipping technique. So you could use tongs like you see here, or if you wanted to do 2 tones, you would dip one side, let it dry, and then hold it, and then dip the other side. Or if you're glazing things with cups that you don't put glaze on, you just hold the foot. So you dip it in there until it reaches the foot. And then this is actually called a viscosity meter. It measures the thickness of your glaze. We don't get this technical here, but when you're dipping your glaze, the viscosity is really important so that you get a good cover coat. All right, so like I said, you're going to be painting your next project with acrylic paint. So some of these techniques, of course, you can use with acrylic paint as well as glaze. And you will need to get some acrylic paint for this project. So if you don't have any already, I would purchase at least the 3 primary colors in black and white, so you can mix some more colors. So techniques that would be glaze only would be inlay, and then glaze pulling and breaking. We'll look at examples of these. Slip carving and marbleized. Ceramics too, you guys are familiar with all of these. And then where you could use both techniques would be sponging, brushing, staining, layering, and glaze trailing. And Sophia, you've got your mic on. Okay, so what is glaze inlay? Glaze inlay, or slip inlay, is when you inlay a different colored clay or slip into your white clay. So you create a texture, and then you paint colored slip, which is thick clay with colorant in it, on top, let it dry, and then you scrape it off. So you get these really beautiful inlaid designs with the different colored clay. You can also do this by painting colored slip, or like dripping colored slip onto the white, letting it dry to the same consistency as the white clay body, and then rolling it flat into the white clay. Glaze pulling and breaking. So I'd mentioned this before, but you could have 2 different colored glazes on a piece with just 1 glaze. And this has to do with the color of your clay body and the texture that you put in your clay. So here we have a stamp, and this is a red clay body, but we put a blue glaze on top that is semi-transparent, and it is going to be thick glaze, but glaze is something that melts in the kiln and it moves over the surface of your piece in the kiln, and it will pool in certain areas that are carved out, so all of the inside areas and the edges, and it will break or melt over the top of the ridges of things. So you have 1 clay and 1 glaze and 2 or 3 or 4 different colors in the surface here. which is really the beauty of it. And then you can get even more complicated. So for example, in this one, they've put a different underglaze underneath, and then they put the same glaze on top. And all of a sudden you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different glazes with different underglazes and the same glaze on top. So this is the glaze that's on top, and these are the underglazes that are underneath. Same here. We've got a yellow underglaze and a pink glaze on top that pulls and breaks. Slip carving. So slip is, like I said, it's a thick, watery version of your clay, but with colors mixed in. So you can buy oxides, which are the natural colorants of the earth, or you could purchase synthetic oxides or colorants from a ceramic store and get brighter colors. And you mix those together, you paint them on the surface of your white clay, and then you carve away and reveal whatever pattern or design you want. And then marbleized clay, that's really fun and a little bit complicated, but you basically layer different colored clays, and then you roll them out together. You can throw with marbleized clay, or you can build slab work with it. Reminding you that Richard Notkin video that we watched where he's making the ears, he did that with marbleized clay. So you saw him making layers of slabs of red and white clay and like wedging them together into a block, and then he would carve with a wire tool. He would cut away the shape of the ear and then eventually carve into it, creating this beautiful marble technique. You could sponge your glaze on, and you can sponge your acrylic onto your clay. FYI, you do all of this after you fire your pieces once. Okay, there's 2 different firings. There's a bisque fire, which is the first time you fire something. You fire it to a lower temperature than you do your glaze fire. And the reason for this is that we want the surface of your clay to remain porous, to accept and absorb the glaze. So you have your bisque fire, and then you have your glaze fire. So when you guys are actually glazing your pieces, and even when you're acrylic painting, you're going to give them to me first. I'm going to bisque fire them, and then I will give them back to you, and you will paint them. Okay, so do not put acrylic paint on your bone dry pieces. I will not be able to fire them if you do, because that acrylic paint will be toxic to burn out in the kiln. So let me say that one more time, because I don't want this to happen to anybody. Do not put paint on your pieces right now, okay? They have to be fired first. And we haven't even made the work. We're going to glaze fire the figures, so don't worry about that. Okay, so you can also brush acrylic on, obviously, and glaze. And staining. So staining is when you paint a color on the surface and you let it dry, and then you wipe it away and it stays in the grooves. And then, several techniques on top of each other. You could do slip carving, you could do staining, and then you could put a glaze on top of that. You could do underglazing and staining and then a glaze on top. So there's so many different things you can do. This artist, her name is Sarah Yeager. She lives in Montana. She's actually friends with Richard Notkin, and I've been to her studio space. I have some of her work. It's beautiful porcelain work, and she slip trails her glaze on. And then I would like you to look at this website. This has a lot of different acrylic painting techniques. So you might be a painter already, you might have already taken Mr. Vedder's painting classes, and you might have a lot of these already underneath your belt of experience, but maybe you don't. So when we get into actually painting the surface of our finals, I'm going to go through and do some demonstrations on a lot of these. Okay? Alrighty, so that is the end of that presentation.